All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see so many faces, if not in person, then at least through the blessing of Zoom. We have some more people coming in through the waiting room now, but we're going to get started. It's a real pleasure to be here in this season of redemption and new possibilities, even though it doesn't necessarily feel that way at every moment, sort of in the calendar, in the Jewish calendar and in the Christian calendar. We are at a moment of thinking about liberation and redemption and what could be in the world that we want to see. And so it feels very appropriate and like an honor to be hosting this conversation with Soffiyah Elijah from the Alliance of Families for Justice. BJ has been partnering with the Alliance for about a year and a half, maybe a little bit more, BJ and SPSA, I should say, through the work of our joint Racial Justice Taskforce, which formed a number of years ago. And you'll hear, I'm not going to say very much about Soffiyah or about the Alliance, you'll hear more about that through the conversation. But I do want to say that I think as more of us are getting more involved and closer to the work of the Alliance, which you'll hear about, it feels very much like a partnership that is enabling the kind of proximity that we've been talking about a lot ever since Brian Stevenson came to our sanctuary a year and a half ago and shared his wisdom and his framework with us for thinking about how do we create change in the ways that we want to see it, and being proximate to the people who are suffering, to people who are experiencing the realities of injustice, the structures of injustice, and that's the place to begin. And I think in many ways this is a partnership that's allowing people who have gotten connected to get proximate and learn more about what is the experience of incarceration, what is the experience of having a family member who is incarcerated, what does that look like, why is it the case. So there are lots of images, narratives, stories that we hold in our minds about why people are incarcerated and what that looks like. And this is a way that we can move beyond whatever stories we might tell ourselves or have inherited from news media and other places, to really get proximate and draw close to people and form relationships and learn. And through that, become more effective allies and partners for creating change in a system that I think many of us know is deeply flawed in this country in terms of what it does and what it is attempting to do. So I will, with that, turn it over to Martha Appelsberg and Jim Melchiori, who are the co-chairs of the BJ SPSA Racial Justice Task Force. And they will introduce Soffiyah. I'm going to invite people to put your questions in the chat box. And so when it gets to Q&A, I will kind of read through the questions and offer them to Martha and Jim and Soffiyah. So you can put the question in the chat box at any time. And I hope you enjoy this conversation, that it inspires you to get even closer and to get involved in this work that we are doing together. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Soffiyah, and thank you, Martha and Jim.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're delighted to be here with all of you today and with Soffiyah to provide an opportunity for more members of our communities to get to know Soffiyah and the work of the Alliance. This is very strange to be talking this way, but okay, I'm going to get used to it. So I'm going to begin with a little bit, a brief history of the BJ SPSA Racial Justice Task Force and our relationship with the Alliance, so that those of you who are not familiar with it will have a sense of the context in which this conversation is taking place. So when BJ and SPSA celebrated the 25th anniversary of our partnership in 2016, we recommitted to the relationship by launching a joint racial justice initiative. And it began with a book study, which many of you may have participated in, the reading and discussing of Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And then after a series of meetings over the course of the following year or so, we began researching a variety of racial justice issues, potential campaigns, possible partner organizations, and we came to recognize that in both communities there was interest in 3 areas: advocacy, direct service, and internal education. In the summer and fall of 2018, after a number of additional educational programs, including a visit by Brian Stevenson that October, we decided to focus our energies on working to end mass incarceration and to partner in that work with the Alliance of Families for Justice. And I want especially at this moment to thank Susan Miller. I don't know if she's on, but who first brought to our attention the work of the Alliance of Families for Justice, and really was the bridge between us and what's now happening. And so after that, more of us began attending monthly meetings and engaging in activities. Last April, almost exactly a year ago, marked our major Let My People Go program that I know a number of you were also at. Was an interfaith racial justice Seder, when some of you had the opportunity to meet and hear from Soffiyah and other members of AFJ, and also to hear from Zachary Katz-Nelson from the New York City Independent Commission on Criminal Justice Reform, addressing issues of mass incarceration, bail reform, etc., in the context of Passover and Easter. During the past year, I would say our engagement with partnership with the AFJ has intensified. Numbers of us had made visits to the district offices of state legislators, engaging as part of the campaign that AFJ has been engaging with to enfranchise people who are in prisons and jails. And more recently in January, a number of us joined other AFJ members to go to Albany to meet with upstate legislators. There were more of those visits planned that were cut short by COVID-19 and the pause. Some of us also attended the trial of officers of the Department of Corrections and Community Services who were responsible for the death of Carl Taylor in Sullivan Correctional Facility exactly 5 years ago today. This is the yahrzeit. You may have read about that in a brief reflection that's went out last week from Galit Lopatin-Bordereau of her experience attending the trial and how that affected her. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do it. It was in the resources BJ sent out last week preparatory to Passover. And more recently, I guess the best piece of good news we've had lately is that BJ SPSA submitted a grant to UJA together with AFJ, and that grant was funded. And so we will now be working together in the future to further to partner on the enfranchisement campaign. So that is a little bit about how we've come to where we are at the moment. Jim is going to talk a little bit about some of our initial engagements with AFJ and what we've learned. Then we'll turn to the conversation.
Thank you, Martha. One of the things I always mention, and as Rabbi Shirley mentioned it, and that is the idea of being proximate. Being proximate and also hearing people's lived experiences. And the third Thursday of the month meetings that we have each month have been very powerful. And, you know, I don't say too much at those meetings because, you know, it's mostly important to kind of listen. And we hear from other members of our community, the AFJ community, about living with the life of mass incarceration. To to be a woman in her 70s and to have to travel a couple of hours upstate to visit a child or a grandchild. Those are lived experiences that are very powerful for me to hear. Also, for example, when people are getting out, when people are coming home, we have a little celebration for them, and we have some food, and those are very, very powerful experiences in terms of being proximate and getting a sense of someone else's lived experience. So I thank you, Felicia. I thank you, Sophia, for that. But the other thing is that the community that we have built with AFJ. I think of Akira, who came on a day that was even rainier than today to talk to us about how to get involved in the Close Rikers movement. I think of Stella, who has organized the trips up to Albany and the picnic that we had along the Hudson back in August. I think of Emily and the incredible organization that her mind is. But you know, what holds it all together is Sophia. And I love her energy. I love her authenticity and the way that she is truly a team builder. So Sophia, thank you for being all the things that you are. And we're glad that you're here with us today.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored and appreciative of all that the Racial Justice Committee does, and the fact that you and Martha and Susan and Judith and so many other members of the committee have been involved in supporting AFJ's work means a lot to me personally, but it means so much to our families and to their loved ones who are incarcerated, to know that they're not forgotten and that there are people on the outside who are working tirelessly to bring about a change to systems that are destroying their lives and the fabric of their communities. I want to thank Martha in particular for mentioning Carl Taylor's name today, the 5th anniversary of the brutal murder that he suffered in Sullivan Correctional Facility. It seems almost oxymoronic to call it a correctional facility. It wasn't that 5 years ago, and it's not that today. And certainly the horror that people are experiencing in New York State prisons and jails and throughout this country in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic serves as a reminder to all of us how important this coalition, this partnership is, and how essential it is that all of us do everything that we can to try to turn things around and to end mass incarceration and to end the inhumanity that exists throughout our society. And so with that, I will, I'll await your questions.
Okay. So AFJ was founded, I believe, just a little over 3 years ago. So Sophia, could you tell us something about what brought you into this work and what AFJ has been doing and where you see things going?
So I got involved, or I should say my awareness about this issue started long before I could say, quote unquote, professional career. It was very personal to me as a teenager. I grew up in Hempstead, Long Island, and many of the people that I went to high school with, at some point during those 4 years would disappear. And it was my understanding, kind of the community mantra was that they had, quote unquote, gone down south to be with family. It wasn't until I was 17 and my boyfriend was one of those people who disappeared. And disappeared just shortly before the senior prom. And you can picture this scene because I'm the president of the senior class. And I finally got the nerve to go to his parents' house, really thinking that I had just been dropped as the girlfriend, only to find from his parents that he was incarcerated upstate. So as soon as I graduated from high school and went off to Cornell University, I found the way to take the bus over to Auburn Prison where he was incarcerated. And not only was I shocked at what the circumstances were of his incarceration, but I also was struck very quickly by the fact that virtually everybody who was sitting wearing a green uniform, like my boyfriend who was being visited, looked like me, and all of the guards looked like most of the people in this audience. And the racial dynamics of what was taking place in the state prisons struck me at age 17 and never left my reality throughout my professional career. I am a criminal defense lawyer by training. I only went to law school because I wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer. And that experience representing people and then going on to teach law school and then work as the executive director of the Correctional Association, where I went inside the facilities and monitored the conditions inside there. I was acutely aware of the mistreatment that people were experiencing and the fact that the larger society not only didn't seem to know, but far too often didn't seem to care about what was happening to their fellow human beings. And so it became my mission to make sure that that changed, that people knew, and that family members who did the time with their loved ones, but they did that time in silence, that they found a voice, that they found support, and that they could be in the forefront of bringing about the change that needed to happen. So that in a nutshell is why I started AFJ.
Okay.
Sophia, I believe before that, though, you actually had some experience with the system. You got a chance to actually see the inside of the system as an attorney. I know you talked about a trip to Attica a few years ago. You really, as an adult, got a chance to see the inside of the system, and maybe you'd like to say a few words about that.
Certainly. Well, first, as a criminal defense lawyer, I had many clients who were incarcerated, and I've visited people in New York State facilities, federal facilities, not only here, but literally all over this country. And I've done that for decades, still doing it, in fact. But then in a more acute way, when I was the executive director of the Correctional Association, it was my responsibility to monitor the conditions in the state prisons and jails throughout New York. And so I traveled all over this state and went inside most of the 50, well, at that time it's over 50 facilities, and walked the bowels of those facilities through the medical units, walked the tiers, the mess hall, recreation, solitary confinement units. I saw all of it. And I spent a lot of time talking to the people who were incarcerated in those facilities to learn firsthand from them what were their experiences. It wasn't so much important what was written on paper as far as what was supposed to happen inside. What was much more important to me was what was actually happening inside those facilities.
So can you tell us, over the course of time, AFJ has developed a number of different program areas, and you and we have learned different things from different ones of them. Can you give people a kind of overview of what AFJ is actually doing?
Certainly. So Alliance of Families for Justice, which we call AFJ, our mission is to support, empower, and mobilize people who are incarcerated and their family members. So we have a number of different parts of the organization. I would say the first part is our family support unit, and our family support unit does exactly that. We are fortunate to have the assistance of a licensed certified social worker named Ramel Washington, who facilitates our family empowerment circles, which meet on Tuesday evenings, which is as a drop-in center at our offices in Harlem. He also provides individual and family counseling to family members and individuals who are in need of additional support. We also provide healing retreats for formerly incarcerated people and for family members, so that there's a place for people to go outside of New York City. And it's a statewide effort. So people and family members come from all over the state and spend the weekend together, engaging in self-care, and also acquiring skills that will enable them to use their voices and their advocacy skills to bring about change. We do a number of additional activities under our family support unit. We also have a legal support unit that is staffed by 2 experienced attorneys and a paralegal. And also Stella supports that unit as our intern. She's on her way to law school in the not too distant future, so it's a perfect match. And through our legal support unit, we address the concerns raised by people who are incarcerated with respect to how their rights are being violated. That could include lack of access to medical care, recreation, mental health support. It could be physical abuse or sexual assault, the whole gamut of concerns that people who are incarcerated may raise with respect to the conditions under which they're held. Our legal support unit tries to address. You might imagine, with 43,000 people incarcerated in New York State's prisons and only 2 lawyers, our legal support unit is overwhelmed with requests on a daily basis. And then we have our advocacy work, and that's part of what Martha and Jim, you referenced, the fact that we are right now engaged in a campaign. It's our civic engagement campaign that has 3 components. One is to restore the right to vote for people who are incarcerated in this state. 2 is to codify the governor's executive order that he implemented last April, which gave the right to vote to people who are on parole. And the 3rd is to increase the civic engagement of people and family members who have incarcerated loved ones. Unfortunately, there is research that, well, the research isn't unfortunate, but the results aren't unfortunate. And the results show that people who have incarcerated loved ones are the least likely to engage in any civic activities. That includes voting, parent-teacher conferences, block associations, any form of self-governance. People who have incarcerated loved ones are the least likely to participate in. So not only are there loved ones who are incarcerated denied the right to vote, family members who have incarcerated loved ones are self-disenfranchising, and we want to reverse that reality and build a stronger and more inclusive democracy by including everybody's voice in the exercise of that democracy. So those are our main components. I'm sure I'm leaving out a few things, but as we talk, hopefully my memory will be jarred and I'll share the other activities with our audience.
Okay. I know that you wanted to say something about language issues, Sophia, so let me just throw that in now and you can make those points.
Thanks, Martha, for reminding me. You know, I have so internalized my own language and what I call my politically correct language with respect to this topic that sometimes I forget to explain to the audience the language that I'm using. So you'll notice in my conversation, I haven't said the word prisoner, convict, felon, ex-con, offender. Any of those terms, you notice I have to push myself to even articulate them now. And that's because as an organization and as an individual, we do not use those words because they objectify human beings. They are labels that basically stigmatize people based on the worst mistake that they ever made in their lives. Those of us who are not incarcerated, I'm sure, in fact, I don't think I've ever met anyone who never made a mistake. I doubt that that's possible. And yet, for those of us who aren't incarcerated, no one labels us based on any mistakes that we may have confessed to have done. We're able to function by our names and who we've quote unquote become in life and the things that we're proud of. And so we do not believe that as a society, we benefit by stigmatizing anyone by their mistakes. We don't want to objectify anybody, so we don't use any of those labels. The fact that someone is incarcerated, we may say someone who is currently incarcerated or someone who's formerly incarcerated. But mostly we like to use the word people because that's what all of us are. And by using that term, it is the most inclusive and non-judgmental term that we can think of. And I would love to take credit for that very enlightened view. However, I want to give credit where credit is due. And that view grows out of some very important work that was started by a man named Eddie Ellis, who was incarcerated in New York State for over 30 years for a crime that he didn't commit. And at the time that he was sent to prison, he was a member of the Black Panther Party. And while he was inside, he used his time to organize and educate other men who were incarcerated with him. And together they came up with the idea that this objectifying and labeling of people was denigrating and not helping anybody's rehabilitation or helping them to return to society, to be contributing members of that society. And so they wrote an open letter where they talked about the use of language and asked people to stop using any of those stigmatizing terms and asked people going forward to simply refer to them as people who are formerly incarcerated or people who are incarcerated. And I would say I internalized that thinking about 12 years ago, and going forward since that time, I have not used those terms, and I encourage other people to practice, because practice makes perfect, practice not using those terms, and eventually you'll find it is just as easy as it has been for me to not use those denigrating terms.
Thank you. Okay, I want to ask, before we open it up to more general questions, I want to ask one more thing, because I know you and I have talked quite a bit about what's happening now in prisons and jails around COVID. And that's been a major concern of yours that been trying to get various entities, state, city, and elsewhere to address. So I wanted to hear from you. I want everybody to be able to hear from you more about what you've learned, both from the families and other sources that you have.
I think if I was to pick one word that described what's happening in New York's prisons and jails right now, the word would be shameful. What we have happening now is a complete disregard for the lives of the people who are incarcerated in our prisons, and a complete disregard for the lives of the people who work in those prisons. I'm going to focus primarily on the people who live in those prisons, because the people who work in those prisons do have the ability to call in sick and not come to work. And quite frankly, quite a few of them have been doing so. And I understand why they would do so, out of a concern for their own health and safety. But the people who are incarcerated don't have the ability to call in sick. They don't have the ability to put on a surgical mask. They don't have the ability to put on latex gloves to protect themselves. And in many instances, if they attempt to cover their faces with a t-shirt or tying together socks, then they'll receive a disciplinary report because the rules in the prison is that you're not supposed to obstruct your appearance. And so there are many facilities where all the medical staff have stopped coming in to work. There's no doctors. The mental health staff have stopped coming in. For those of you who don't know, the modest estimate as to the number of people, the percentage of people who are incarcerated in New York's facilities who are on the Department of Mental Health caseload is between 60 and 70%. So if you think about 60 to 70% of the population is not receiving any mental health care during this COVID-19 pandemic that is racing through the prisons. In the facilities, the people who are tasked with cleaning the facilities are incarcerated people. They are not being given special training with respect to how they should sanitize the facilities. And what's been happening is they've been given bleach and told, here's the bleach, use the bleach. They are being given gloves and masks, but the rest of the population is not. There's no hand sanitizer or antimicrobial soap in most of the facilities. Just last week, some of the facilities started to get the hand sanitizer dispensers minus the hand sanitizer. That has yet to arrive. People who are showing symptoms are being quarantined. They're being put in a separate unit of the facility. Most of them are still not being tested, and they're not being taken to the hospital. They're being told that there's no point in taking them to the hospital because they're not going to get any care different from what they would receive in the quarantine space in the facility. So another thing that is happening is over 300 guards have tested positive for the virus. The Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, which we call DOCS, has reported that about 60 people who are incarcerated have tested positive. Now, it's hard to understand how 300 guards could test positive, but only 60 people who are incarcerated could test positive, since they're all in the same space, unless the people who are incarcerated, by and large, are not being tested. And that's exactly what's happening. So, for instance, at Shawangunk facility, a guard tested positive. None of the people on the unit where he was assigned were surveyed for symptoms, nor were they tested for symptoms. The only thing that was done was that they were all placed on lockdown, which means they can't come out of their cells. Now, all of us have been barraged with the admonishment that we engage in social distancing and stay 6 feet away from everybody, right? So I want you to try to imagine what social distancing looks like in a maximum security facility where people are literally housed in cages side by side. It's the idea of being 6 feet away from anybody in a maximum security facilities is a total non-starter. It's impossible. But similarly, in medium and minimum security facilities where people are housed in a dormitory setting in bunk beds, you also can't be 6 feet away from anybody. And so I don't remember which official on the federal level described the prisons and the jails like a petri dish, but the jails and the prisons are exactly that, a petri dish for this virus to spread rapidly throughout those facilities. On the government level, Governor Cuomo has not made any statements or implemented any plan to release any of the people who are incarcerated, not the vulnerable populations, not the older people, not people who show significant medical conditions that the CDC has identified. What the governor has said is that people can apply for medical clemency, but there's a number of advocacy organizations who have been working together and submitted dozens and dozens of applications for medical release for people who fall in these vulnerable categories. And the response that has been received from the governor's office is, well, this is no different from medical parole. And unless somebody is within 6 months of terminal illness, then they're not going to be released. And so the people who are inside are literally left to die, and their family members could not be more upset, frustrated, and stressed about what's happening to their loved ones, and they have every reason to be.
Rabbi, surely this might be a time to begin to address some questions from our group, and then we will get back to maybe talking about what we can do in our own quarantine situation to advocate. Unless you want to do that first, Sophia.
Well, let's hear some questions, because I think sometimes the answers to the questions can also help to explain what can be done.
Great.
Sure.
Rabbi Shirley?
Yes, thank you so much, Sophia. In fact, there are quite a number of questions related to what's going on now with the coronavirus and COVID-19. So, two questions about what is being done. Are there any lawsuits that you're aware of against the prison, in New York State, New York City, regarding what's happening in terms of the coronavirus? And also a question about sort of public strategy or public outcry against this. A question noting that there have been demonstrations done in front of ICE detention centers to protest detention of undocumented immigrants. Could similar demonstrations be organized outside one of the correctional facilities to bring demands forward? Obviously, that would have to be after we're no longer in quarantine. But would that be a strategy that you, from your perspective, might be effective?
Okay, those are both excellent questions. First, let me talk about lawsuits. As I explained, I am a lawyer, and early on, I said that I think the only thing that can be done on the legal front is for lawyers to go into court and file for injunctive relief, to ask for a TRO, is a temporary restraining order, to stop the state from engaging in neglect of the health needs and medical needs of the incarcerated population. The reason I suggested that strategy is because it's expedited. It doesn't drag on for months and months in court. You can get a decision fairly quickly. I know that strategy has been used in some other states. As I'm speaking to you, I have not heard that any group has brought a legal action in New York State to address these concerns using or trying to get injunctive relief. That doesn't mean some entity isn't working on it. I just haven't heard of it. And I've been on countless conference calls daily, a variety of different groups on the state and national level. And so I just haven't heard of it. But hopefully I'm just ignorant of something that's happening, and people are, maybe the ink is drying right now. I'm certainly hoping so. With respect to demonstrations,
Let me just jump in to clarify, because I misunderstood the question. That apparently there are car rallies being done now in front of detention centers with people in cars demonstrating. So
I was going to, actually, I'm aware that in Ossining, New York, there was a car caravan and car demonstration in front of Sing Sing facility because a person who was incarcerated died from COVID-19 at the Sing Sing facility. I am a person, and even as a law professor, I used to always tell my students there are times when the law is an asset and there's times when it gets in the way, and that's where civil disobedience comes into play. I am not sure in this particular instance that rallies are the main way to go. And I'm not saying that they aren't the way to go, but I am concerned that the level of indifference that has been shown by the New York State leadership is one that's not going to be moved by rallies and car demonstrations. And I wish it was otherwise. I wish that large numbers of people, or many people signing on to a petition, or in fact that the letter that was sent to Governor Cuomo and the Commissioner of Docks, Tony Annucci, sent last month on March 20th by the heads of the Corrections Committee for the Senate and the Assembly for New York, from Assemblyman Weprin and Senator Sepulveda. I wish that would have had some impact on the governor, but it hasn't. And so I think it is time for people to get more creative in how they think about trying to apply pressure. I'm certainly thinking about that. Some of the ideas I have are too embryonic to share right now. I'm hoping that they'll be impactful on the governor, but so far he has not risen to the occasion. And for those people who are thinking, well, yes, he has a lot of things to juggle, he absolutely does. And I understand that. The rate of death in New York City from the COVID-19 virus is frightening and dismal and traumatic. But I also know that several years ago, when there was an escape affected by two men from the Clinton facility, Governor Cuomo showed up at that facility within 24 hours to walk the tier and threaten any of the people who were incarcerated on that tier that if they had any information or they were involved in any way with respect to that escape, then they would be dealt with in fast order. So if he could respond that quickly to two people out of the over 50,000 who were incarcerated at that time, the fact that there are 43,000 people sitting in a petri dish, it seems to me should get his undivided attention.
So this is, I think, a related question regarding the governor and his daily press conferences. We have David is noting that he hasn't heard questions about incarcerated people or rates of infection in the prisons. And why might that be the case? Is there a thought among either your organization or other organizations that work on these issues to try to have reporters raise those questions to highlight the problems at the press conferences and in the media?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. I think you said David raised the question. Thank you, David. You may have missed it. Actually, some reporters recently did ask Governor Cuomo exactly about what was being done for people who are incarcerated. And he said they have everything that they need. Okay, people who need to be quarantined are quarantined, and all the supplies that are needed inside the prisons and jails are there. In other words, I think it's okay to say this right after Passover. It was a blatant lie. Okay.
I'm just reading, there's another question that I'm reading through, but while I'm reading through that to get to the nugget of the question, you know, I think this takes us back to one question that came up earlier in the chat and that I think, Jim, you were referencing earlier, is both regarding the current situation in terms of COVID in the prisons and more in general. What are things that, what can we do? Where is there a place for, where is AFJ taking action, and where can we as allies and supporters of AFJ take action?
Thank you. It's a very important question. I think at this point, we're talking about as much public pressure as we can possibly bring to bear. If anyone has connections to unions, to get the unions to write to the governor, use social media. Certainly, the Racial Justice Committee and these two congregations can bring their pressure to bear. If you're part of any other larger coalitions, please ask the members of those coalitions to bring their pressure to bear on the governor. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the people who rely on votes, that's the only thing that I think is going to matter to them. And as a head of a nonprofit, I am not engaging in campaigning or supporting any particular candidate. I am very much engaging in trying to save lives. And so I think that it's important for people to make their concerns known as loudly as possible to the governor's office. The fact that the legislative office building is basically shut down really hinders us, because otherwise we'd be flooding Albany every single day. I don't think driving around the Capitol is going to be particularly useful, so I'm not suggesting that people drive up to Albany, but there are a number of different places of influence that I think this grouping and others have access to, and get the word out that we have to make our voices and our concerns known. And you can pressure members of the Senate and the Assembly certainly, but I think that pressure has been applied and the governor's still ignoring it. So I think in this instance, we have to go straight to him. And I will say, this is a situation where it's not the Commissioner of Corrections, Tony Annucci, who is refusing to release people or to implement a plan. And Tony and I know each other well, and he knows that I don't let him off the hook very often. And I'm not letting him off the hook this time. But in this instance, it is the governor who is making all the decisions about what's happening inside the prisons and jails. So this is where we have to apply the pressure.
Thank you. We have two questions related to, and you referenced the unions and the corrections officers. Where do the corrections officers stand in all of this? I think that's speaking to the specific situation about COVID in the prisons and what a corrections officers think should be done. And then earlier, before we started talking about COVID, there was a question more generally about what has been your interaction with corrections officers. I'm just going back to the question right now. Have you been able to talk to any of the guards or the corrections officers? What do they have to say about the realities of incarceration?
Okay, so I'll start with what the union has been asking for. The union was pressuring to receive masks and gloves. First, they wanted to bring their own equipment and they were forbidden from doing that. Then the rules were relaxed and they could bring their own equipment. And just recently, they were able to get the department to agree to provide them with the necessary masks and gloves that they're supposed to have. I think we should pause and understand that unfortunately, the relationship, and I use that term loosely, between the guards and the people who are incarcerated has not been a positive one. Now, certainly there are exceptions. There are guards who do their job with humanity in their heart and who believe that rehabilitation and assisting the people who are unfortunate enough to be incarcerated is an important part of their work, and that's what their focus is. Unfortunately, there is a culture within the prison guards union that mistreats, dehumanizes, and abuses people who are incarcerated through racial slurs, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological torture. And I don't use any of those terms lightly, but over the many, many years that I've been engaged in this work, I can't think of any more accurate ways to describe the treatment that people receive inside at the hands of guards. Again, there are exceptions, and fortunately there are exceptions. The fact that we are having this session, this webinar today, on the 5th anniversary of the murder of Carl Taylor, who was murdered by guards. He wasn't murdered by someone else who was incarcerated with him. He was murdered by guards after months and months of being mistreated by guards. And the reality is what happened to Carl Taylor, unfortunately, is quite the norm. He was on the mental health caseload, and there's a very high percentage of mistreatment of people who have mental health needs inside, because it's always easy to say, well, that person started acting out and threatened a guard, and then that's an excuse for the mistreatment that they are then subjected to. So the question about whether or not I have talked to guards and asked them what they want, let's start with, I spent 5 years as being the executive director of the Correctional Association, an organization that was founded in 1844 and has the unique distinction of having legislative authority to monitor the conditions inside the prisons and jails in this state. When I started to head the organization, it was almost 170 years old, and it was the first time in the history of the organization that the head of the organization was not a white man. So when I would walk the tiers of the various prisons and jails, things shook up because the guards did not want me talking with the people who were incarcerated, most of whom looked like me. They did not want me going to the New York Times or to the Department of Justice and highlighting what they were doing to people inside. They did not want me sharing the fact that far too many of them wore a tattoo on their arm that showed an image of a Black baby on a pitchfork or hanging from a noose. This is the kind of treatment, this is the kind of mentality that exists inside the prisons and jails in this state. So I don't think it comes as a surprise that they weren't interested in talking with me.
If I could just jump in here for a second. I mean, I think what Sophia is saying was just so blatantly obvious to us when we were sitting at the trial in Lower Manhattan of those, of the DOCS officers. I mean, they kept trying to say that nobody saw any violence, nobody, you know, nobody saw anything. Somehow or another, this man ended up strangled, but nobody saw any evidence of it. But what was clear, even from the testimony that came through, was that the person who was the sergeant who was doing most of the training of new DOCS officers was somebody who had a reputation, not just in that facility, but basically throughout the facility, as terribly violent. He'd been written up multiple times and nothing had ever been done to him or about him, or he hadn't been disciplined in any way. But he was the person to whom they were sending new corrections officers to be trained by. That was one of the things that most blew my mind when we were sitting at that trial. I mean, there were many things that blew my mind, but that was certainly one of them. And I think just disregard for the humanity of the people who were imprisoned.
Yeah, I would agree, Martha. And the lack of oversight and the speed with which concealment was taking place. One of the people who testified was an incarcerated person who had been tasked with cleaning up the area where Carl Taylor's beating had occurred. And that was basically a job that was ordered to be done pretty much within the hour of when it happened, which would not be any way that would be a legitimate way to handle an incident like that. So that was very dramatic to me. Also, the oversight that Martha referred to, certain officers who were being written up again and again and again, but nothing was being done. Obviously, and even the other thing that struck me was, and was sitting next to Sophia the day that the medical examiner testified, and an autopsy was being performed on Carl Taylor before his sister and family had even been notified that he had died. So in this particular case, it's good that the autopsy was held, because the evidence that was testified to by the medical examiner was very damning. But again, just the lack of humanity that would be happening without even his sister and the rest of the family knowing. I think there were many dramatic revelations to us in that trial. Things that probably wouldn't be that surprising to you, right, Sophia?
No, unfortunately. And I want to add something because there's a response that I frequently hear, and sometimes even Tony Annucci will say, "Well, Sophia, we're trying to weed out a few bad apples." Okay. So I just want to dispel the idea that we're talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about a rotten orchard. Okay. This situation that happened to Mr. Taylor, every single day in every single prison, someplace in this state, someone is being beaten within an inch of their life. It is the norm. And it may sound like it's overly dramatic, but if you have walked as many tiers and talked to as many people who are incarcerated as I have, you would reach the same conclusion. What is happening inside these prisons is absolutely horrific. And so the treatment that people are getting, or the lack of treatment that people are getting in response to COVID-19, comes as no surprise. It is totally consistent with the utter disregard for their health and safety.
Sophia, thank you. I want to bring a couple of other questions that people put in the chat together with one of my own, and I want to preface it by sharing with you and with folks on this call who may not know that that B'nai Jeshurun 2 years ago actually had a very interesting, unexpected encounter with a group of corrections officers from Michigan. I don't know if Martha's told you about this. She was one of the people who was part of the group that spent a couple of days out there, and then this small group of COs came to New York and spent a couple of days with BJ, and it was an opportunity for us to kind of get to know that side of the prison system and that proximity in a very different way. And I will say that I think that the head of the union in Michigan Corrections Organization, is a very, very special, unique person who may not be representative in any way of other CO unions in other states, and things of course differ very much from state to state and perhaps even from prison to prison. But I guess the question that came up for me, and I think for some of us who were in that group that got to know some of those COs, is that we kind of learned that there were places where people who were incarcerated and organizations advocating for the rights of those incarcerated had actually the very same interests as the corrections officers. And there weren't really mechanisms, this is not so surprising, for those organizations and the union to work together to shape policy or to create change. Do you see, and again, New York may be very different from Michigan, I suspect that it is from what I've heard. Do you see that there's any role in, or any possibility of working with corrections officers, with the union, with the DOC, and that sort of came to some of the questions that were in the chat? Is there training that might be provided for COs that would create a different culture? Where are there possibilities for that? Are there possibilities, and where might they be for change of the culture and for the union and COs and organizations like AFJ to actually work productively together?
First of all, thank you for that question. It's actually one that I hear frequently when I speak. I am less familiar with Michigan, although I went to law school there, but as my sons would say, it's back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, so I can't speak to what is happening with corrections in Michigan right now. I'm much more familiar with New York. I can say this. When I was with the Correctional Association, and still, there are whistleblowers, people of good heart who work inside the system, who reach out to me and share inside information about what's going on behind the walls. They do so obviously at great risk, not only for their jobs, but for their physical safety, because they're threatened by their colleagues if they appear to be sympathetic with the people who are incarcerated. It's ironically very similar to the way, well, I won't go there. I was going to have a historical reference to slavery, but I'm going to stay in the present for now. You ask if there's a way to work with the corrections officers and their union. I think that the onus is on them. And I'll say that because they are the ones who are brutalizing people. Martha and Jim described what they saw at that trial of Carl Taylor. Literally 8 days after Carl Taylor was murdered in Sullivan, Samuel Harrell was murdered in Fishkill facility in very similar circumstances. Law enforcement, district attorneys, they all worked together to cover up what happened. So I think first, if we had a head of the Corrections Officers Union, it's called NYSCOBA, who said, We're not going to hire anybody who's wearing a tattoo of a Black baby hanging from a noose. We're not going to tolerate racial slurs. We're not going to tolerate sexual assault. We're not going to tolerate abuse of power. We're not going to tolerate having someone who's on staff whose use of force incidents quadruple the next officer on staff in that facility. When those kinds of changes happen, when the prison guards union starts to show that in fact it wants to start functioning in a professional way and that their officers are no longer going to be the deliverers of pain and physical and psychological abuse, I'd be more than happy to sit down and talk with them. I only hope that I live long enough to have that opportunity.
So, Sophia, I'm wondering, if the orchard is rotten, maybe there's not much we can do short of, and this is a big, big question, short of abolition.
Well, I am an abolitionist at heart. In fact, to the core, I'm also a practical strategist. And so I know we are not going to get to abolition before a lot more changes in this society. So as many of the men and women that I spoke with when I would walk the tiers of the facilities, and they knew who I was. I love the fact they had done their research. Right? They didn't have to try to figure out who I was. First of all, I was the first person who looked like me in his job in 170 plus years. So I found it easy to pick out of a crowd. But they would say to me, you know, it's really good that you're trying to get rid of prisons and jails, but while you're working on that, could you make sure that I can get to sick call? Can you make sure they stop throwing out my legal mail? And could you stop that CO from beating the heck out of me or beating the guy who's down the tier who's handling who's been trying to harm himself, and instead of getting help for him, the CO just gave him the top of a metal can, so that he could cut himself some more. Right, so I'm focusing, I'm multitasking, shall we say. So I've got my sights on abolition, but I also have my sights on how do we reduce the amount of human suffering that people are being exposed to on a daily basis. And it's that human suffering that our family members inside are so very concerned about. I mean, I've had clients die inside. I've had clients who I went to visit who were so destroyed by solitary confinement they couldn't talk in complete sentences. I've had clients who were beaten so badly that when they came out for a legal visit, I did not recognize them from the time when I had originally done their arraignment. So I don't have any doubt in my mind that something radical needs to change. And it may not be that you can fix the rotten orchard, question that you raised, Jim. There's something, and I'm sure people are thinking, well, what can we do? She sounds like Debbie Downer, everything is doom and gloom. So I think one of the things we should push for is that before anyone can be hired to do the job, that means they are responsible for the care, custody, and safety of someone whose liberty has been taken away, that they have to be screened by a committee of community members. That the idea that you would brutalize the son or daughter of your next door neighbor is probably less likely to happen if there's been a community vetting of who you are, so that you are not going to go into some facility, take out a baton, and beat somebody within an inch of their life. You're not going to choke someone like Mr. Taylor was choked, such that all the bones in his neck were crushed. Those things should never happen. You should never be on the payroll of this state, paid with taxpayers' dollars, and be allowed to abuse a single human being. And the mantra from the guards union is, well, we have a very dangerous job and these are violent individuals. Well, the level of abuse and mistreatment that happens in the prisons in New York State and throughout this country, you don't find that replicated in a lot of other countries where they're also incarcerating people. But the mindset and the training and the selection process for the people who are going to do those jobs is very, very different from what we do here. most of the prisons in New York State are located upstate New York. Most of the people who are incarcerated in those prisons come from the greater metropolitan area of New York City. There was a time when New York had a thriving agricultural economy in upstate New York, and that has been pretty much obliterated. So many of the people who grew up and believed that their lives were going to be farmers, where they were going to be herding cows and sheep, now find themselves getting off of tractors and going inside prisons, given a baton, and now they're herding people. And they don't have any more training for herding people than they had for herding sheep, except they don't kick and abuse and kill the sheep, but they kick and abuse and kill the people.
And just to quickly add one more thing, and then we can go back to the questions, but one of the things that Sophia mentioned that is very striking that we learn when we go to the third Thursday of the month meetings, is that a lot of things are just little, they seem like little things, but they're not. Like, for example, someone drives 2 hours to visit their loved one, and then they have to stand in line for another hour and a half, so that the visit can only be 45 minutes. The difficulty in getting a package, new rules about getting a package. So as Sophia says, on the perhaps long road to abolition, she's trying to multitask with other smaller but significant steps. I would welcome or urge anybody in this group that wants to start coming to those meetings, that you will hear a lot about the small things that are not small things when it actually involves a member of your family.
And Jim, you mentioned riding 2 hours to visit. In New York, if you have a 2-hour ride, that's considered short, because
right.
If your loved one's incarcerated up in Clinton, which is like 15 minutes from the Canadian border, you're riding all night long. I've made that bus ride all the way up to the Canadian border to go visit a client or to go visit a friend. If your loved one's out in Attica in the western part of the state, that wipes out your weekend.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Patero Sabuni, who was a chaplain in Sing Sing for many years, would run weekend bus trips literally to Buffalo, where you would leave on Friday morning, Friday afternoon, and maybe come back very late on Saturday night, because it was, Buffalo is what, 400 miles from here.
And we're talking about, and rightly so, a focus on the mistreatment of people who are incarcerated. But when their family members go to visit, they're also mistreated by the guards. I don't want to go down that road. Some of the horrific things that our family members have reported have been said to them and done to them when they go to visit their loved ones. So for the people who feel that I should sit and talk with the prison guards union, since they are equal opportunity abusers, they're going to have to make some significant changes before I'm going to sit at a table talking to them.
Rabbi Shuli, more questions?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions now that I think will be sort of take us into the landing, because they really are about what is it that we can do. A number of people are interested in the Thursday meetings. First of all, are they happening now? Are they happening online? And if they're not, if they are, how can one get involved? If they're not happening now, how can one get involved once they resume? And also, what else is there that we can do? And I think Martha mentioned, and you spoke a bit about the civic engagement campaign and voter engagement work that you are organizing, and that the funding from UJA Federation of New York is going to help support in partnership. And I know we have a couple of folks from UJA on this call wanting to learn more about AFJ. And so tell us a little bit about that campaign. What can we do? When are the Thursday meetings starting up again? You've got a lot of eager folks here.
Okay, well, that's great. So I guess if we knew when the what I call the stay-at-home order, those of us who think we're in free society, we're on lockdown as well. when the lockdown will be lifted. And it's interesting, when people are incarcerated and they're put on lockdown, they don't know when it's going to end either. But they're not able to go outside across the street and walk their dog. But we don't know. The short answer is we have held all of our community organizing meetings literally around the corner from our office in Harlem at the National Black Theater. Well, the National Black Theater obviously is a place where people congregate, and they cannot open back up until the order to have all places where people congregate, including places of worship, is lifted. So for now, we're not having in-person community organizing meetings. We are debating whether or not we can start back up by doing it through Zoom or some other online system. There's so many of them. First, we're concerned as to whether or not we can train our members to use the technology. As Jim and Martha have seen, some of our members are octogenarians. Am I using that term correct?
Yes.
And some have not touched a laptop computer ever. The use of the technology could be a challenge for some of our family members. So we're trying to figure out if we can create a way to get them trained on the technology so that they can participate. Because the whole purpose of the community organizing meetings is for family members to have a space, a safe space, where they can share what has been their experience, what is happening with their loved ones inside, and to work on strategies to bring about change. So our volunteers, our members who come, who do not have a lived experience, come with the mindset, the way Martha and Jim have, as to how can we help? What is it that we can do that can support whatever initiatives we're undertaking to try to bring about change, and to also spread the word about what the reality is inside. So I will certainly let you know as soon as we figure out what technology will work best, what time of day works best. I am actually quite impressed with the fact that our Zoom event today has not dropped off by an overuse of the internet, as several of the other Zoom calls I have been on recently have happened. Maybe because it's Easter Monday, people are slow to get back to business. Let's hope. So we have to figure out the best time of day and what's the best method to engage with as many people as want to be involved as possible. I'm really, really thankful that so many people on this call are interested in getting involved. With respect to well, let's talk about the COVID-19 virus pandemic first. As I said earlier, I think people should call the governor's office. Probably social media is one of the most effective things to do right now. And Martha and Jim probably know one of the things that I usually advocate is mail, because the governor's office counts every piece of mail. So AFJ has perfected postcard campaigns because they're the least expensive thing to produce and to get off into the governor's office, and they count each postcard just like a letter. Problem is, since the place is shut down, we don't think that there's a lot of impact that's going to be happening from flooding the place with mail. Plus, most people don't want to even go out to the mailbox. So we've kind of abandoned that approach right now, and we're encouraging people as much as possible to use social media. If it would be helpful for this group, I can, after we're done, by the end of today, send you some hashtags. For those of you who like kind of, sexy hashtags, we can get some hashtags to you. But I think the main message is we're concerned about our brothers and sisters who are behind the walls. They're living in a petri dish, and we are in the epicenter for this nation of this pandemic. And these people are sitting literally in like death tanks, and that cannot be tolerated. So I would urge people to use all spheres of influence that they have available to them around COVID-19. And then of course, I would ask people to support our campaign around civic engagement, because I think we can all connect the dots. If the people who were incarcerated had the right to vote, they would not be ignored by Governor Cuomo in the face of this pandemic. That I am certain of. That's at least 43,000 votes he'd have to be concerned with, not something he can ignore. So there is a very straight line connecting our civic engagement work with the systemic change that we want to bring about. So if anybody is interested in getting involved in our civic engagement work, I would ask you to, one, reach out to Martha and Jim. They know that we have a standing call, usually on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. It's a conference call, so you don't have to know Zoom, Google Hangout, or any of those other interesting developments that happen every other week. You just have to be able to dial your phone, and you can join the conference call to discuss how we're going to expand our civic engagement work. Part of which includes the fact that we're producing, I think we're going to get 20,000 of these posters, Martha and Jim. There's a poster that has been developed by a group called the Center for Urban Pedagogy, with which AFJ has been partnering. And it's a poster about civic engagement. It's a beautiful color poster, opens up into 8-page spread, and we're going to be spreading them, pardon the pun, all over the state. So we're looking for volunteers to help us with bundling those up, addressing envelopes, mailing them out all over the state. Since we're still engaged in social distancing, if anybody's interested in doing that, we can arrange to have bundles dropped off to people who, with a list of who they're mailing them to. And then we'll put the postage on and get them out. I'm expecting we're probably going to have them by the end of this month, if all goes well.
Let me just put in a plug here that in addition to volunteers to help bundling, there's going to be a cost incurred for the printing of these posters and for the mailing. And I think we've been trying to think about what kind of a fundraising campaign to start up, but if anyone wants to donate, begin by donating to AFJ to start funding that project, that would be another way to help in the immediate future. And it's afj.org. Right?
Thank you, Martha. I think, no, it's actually, it's AFJ-NY.
Oh, right, afj-ny.org, right.
Thank you. Our development director, Emily, would be most upset with me if she knew I didn't ask for people to help us with deferring the cost of printing the posters and the postage. But I think people will love the poster. They look beautiful and quite impactful, and they're in English and Spanish. And we had the involvement of family members giving feedback throughout the entire process to make sure that the posters spoke to the people who were trying to organize to get involved in this particular campaign.
Yeah, and we were involved in some of the meetings too, and it was very much a community kind of experience where folks, again, with lived experience, were able to recognize certain things in terms of the design of the poster and say, no, that's not going to work. You need to change that. Again, the value of proximity and the value of hearing the lived experiences of people.
Great, thank you. We will be sure to send out information to all of you, hopefully, certainly not today, but hopefully within the next few days, with some sample language, hashtags, links, things that you can do to be in touch with the governor to get more connected to AFJ. And once meetings start up again, either in person or by Zoom, we'll make sure you have the information for all of that. And again, I want to thank UJA Federation of New York, who's going to be supporting this new civic engagement campaign, and there will be more ways for BJ and SPSA members to get involved in that and to support that. So we look forward to sharing all that information with you. And I think you've helped us end on a note of hope, Sophia, which again is one of the Brian Stevenson's pillars to not give up hope and not lose hope, and certainly is one of the messages of this time of year. And in the Jewish tradition, we talk about the Passover story, and the Seder is going from yagon l'simcha, from distress to happiness, from shame to redemption, that there's a journey that we're taken on, and hopefully we are all headed on that journey together, and we're so glad to be in partnership with you on that. I know Martha wanted to close us out with a few words, and so I'll just take this last opportunity to say thank you again to you and to Martha and Jim for leading the task force, and to everyone who's been involved thus far, and to all of you for joining today. Thank you so much. Martha.
Okay, I just wanted to end with one of my favorite quotes from Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, or ethics of our ancestors, I guess I should say, but from Rabbi Tarfon, it's not for you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. I always ended all of my classes with that quote, and it feels like it's where we are now. We're not going to finish this work today or tomorrow or next week, but we need to keep going with it. And I want to thank Sophia so much for being here. And I thought we might end the way, give people a taste of the way we end AFJ meetings. I won't ask everybody to say a word of how you're feeling, but I will ask people to put your hands out to the edges of your screen so that we can all hold hands. And that's how the AFJ meetings end. So thank you. Thank you. I can't figure out in which way is up and down. But anyway, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for UJA and this committee. This task force has been amazing. And I know together we can bring about the world that we want our children and our grandchildren to inherit.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.